Are we good to go, Ria?
Yep, good to go.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is an E3G media briefing on the state of play in the climate negotiations here in Baku. My name is Alden Meyer. I'm a senior associate based in E3G's Washington office. With me today is Ana Mulio Alvarez, who is based in our Brussels office and is an expert both on climate finance, the so-called NCQG, New Collective Quantified Goal, and also adaptation and loss and damage. We hope to be joined shortly by Rob Moore, who is the director of the Public Banks Program at E3G. So hopefully he will also be joining us. What we're going to do is we're going to start with some brief opening remarks. I will say a little bit about what we've been witnessing coming out of the leaders segment of this meeting, and then the state of play on the global stock take and mitigation, and some of the information we're picking up about the possibility of what's called a cover text, which is sort of a broad political text developed by the presidency. And then Ana will cover what's going on with adaptation and the discussions in rooms on that, which have been very intense. And then we will talk about the finance issues, of course, which are at the core of the political negotiations here this 2 weeks. So with that, and then we will, of course, open it up to your questions, your comments. You can either put a question in the chat, or you can raise a hand and I will call on you to ask your question. So just starting with the leaders, there are still statements underway where you have, I think this afternoon, some more statements to be made, but we're through the bulk of the statements. And I think what we've seen overall, I'm not going to go statement by statement. We can share details of our thoughts on the different countries if you have them, but we've seen a number of countries making resounding calls for expanded and accessible and transparent climate finance at the scale that's needed to deal with the climate crisis. And that, of course, includes the investments needed to decarbonize development pathways in developing countries so that they don't replicate the developed world's fossil intensive development strategy. They also include investments in building adaptation and resilience, and Ana will speak to those in a minute. And then, of course, the newest element of the finance puzzle is loss and damage, which is the now unavoidable impacts that countries are experiencing because we didn't do enough to address climate change in previous years. We saw very clear statements of those needs. We saw well, there were sort of clarion calls for scaling up finance. There were very few concrete announcements or commitments. One that Ana can talk about was an additional contribution by Sweden on the loss and damage front, but nothing of the scale that's needed. We saw one new nationally determined contribution under Paris put forward by the United Kingdom, by Prime Minister Starmer yesterday. We can talk about that. But none of the countries that have either put forward their NDCs or that are signaling what they're likely to do in their NDCs are yet making a commitment to scale back fossil fuel production, as the science says is needed to have any chance of being aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's true for UAE and their announcement last Friday. It's true for what we believe Azerbaijan, the host country, will be saying. It's true for what Brazil is signaling, even though they haven't put out their full NDC. And I would also say it's true for the major Western fossil fuel producing countries, including my own, the United States, but Norway, Australia, Canada, potentially UK. We're still hopeful that the UK may say something on this when they put out their detailed NDC early next year. So I think the legitimate question for leaders is, the rhetoric is great, but are you actually going to step up and walk the talk, make your actions consistent with your rhetoric, or will we just see progress continuing at a relatively cautious pace? And of course, we know we're nowhere near on track to close the ambition gap by 2030 as needed to have any chance of getting close to 1.5 degree temperature limits. So that's the major test over the next months. We don't expect a lot more developments over the next week and a half here in Baku, but that is coming at us soon. And of course, one of the major issues in the negotiations has been how do we ensure that the breakthrough agreements that we got at last year's COP in Dubai on issues like tripling renewable energy, doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements, transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy sector, and similar commitments on areas like methane, land use, agriculture. How do we assure that those are fully reflected in the next round of commitments under Paris? And I think you're seeing tremendous resistance from some countries to any expectation being created that that's going to happen. They say that's reopening the global stock take mandate and renegotiating the outcome last year in Dubai. We would say no, that's actually living into the decision and giving it some meaning and disabusing the Saudi claim that this is an a la carte menu and countries can just pick and choose what parts of that decision they're going to address. Of course, we've also seen developments on finance and adaptation this week and teeing up for the endgame negotiations next week when ministers come in and take over. And Rob and Anna will talk about that in a minute. The other thing I would say is there's a lot of pressure from developed countries and for a number of the developing country groups like the small island states, like the least developed countries, like the progressive Latin countries and others to have something coming out of here on mitigation ambition. The need to really show progress on reducing emissions, on decarbonizing key sectors of the global economy. And again, we've seen those discussions stalemated in the negotiating rooms, in the mitigation work program, in the just transition work program. And so that's starting to be very frustrating to those countries. And we will see at the end of the 2 weeks what happens. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Rob, who has now joined us, is that to get the agenda approved and get the negotiations underway yesterday, after a day waiting for the plenary to approve the agenda, the Azerbaijani presidency agreed to take a number of issues under consultation. One, of course, is what is the scope of the stock take dialogues, the so-called UAE global stock take dialogues over the next several years. One group of countries say that should be limited to finance only. Other countries, including all the developed countries and some developing countries, say no, it needs to include finance, but also be more broad and look at the energy transition, look at some of the other elements. That's a very tough issue. China has tabled an agenda proposal following on the one Brazil did, going into Dubai last year to have a discussion on unilateral trade measures, which of course is a very polarized topic. There are also issues about special circumstances of African countries, special circumstances of mountain countries, and other issues that the president's going to have to grapple with, as well as managing the negotiations on the NCQG and other fronts. So it's a very tough landscape that we're dealing with. I've been at these meetings, 28 of the 29 COPs. It always, you start to feel a little bit of sense of crisis and desperation at this point and going into the middle weekend. And then the ministers arrive and take over, brokering political compromises and putting together with the presidency and the secretariat the final political package at the end of the 2 weeks. So we're in that sort of down part of the cycle right now. My prediction is that will stabilize and start to come up hopefully beginning next week. But I think it's still uncertain whether we're going to get the kind of ambitious package on finance and other issues that we need at the end of this COP, whenever it ends next Friday night, Saturday, Sunday morning, whenever. So let me stop there and turn it over to Rob to talk about the finance and particularly the centerpiece of the negotiations here, the so-called NCQG. Rob, are you able to come in? Should I have Anna start an adaptation for? Oh, there you go.
No, we're good. I just had technical issues on meeting. So hi everyone, sorry to be late. I'm Rob. I'm E3G's Associate Director for Public Banks and Development, so I cover most of our climate finance brief. I was previously the UK's lead climate finance negotiator for a number of years, so I've done a fair few of the cuts from the other side of the fence. So many of you will have, I think, joined our previous briefings, giving an overview of the new goal before COP, and the gist of what we outlined there was that we are in a situation where there is a big gulf between what is actually needed by developing countries and what current uh, political reality means that many developed countries are able to commit to at the moment. Um, and what we are trying to do and what negotiators are trying to do through the course of the next 2 weeks is try to figure out what is a pathway by which the developing countries who are going to be submitting their NDCs next year or who are facing climate impact can have confidence that the finance that they need in order to implement is going to flow. Um, at the moment, many of the figures that are being flouted in the negotiation meetings are the same ones that have been flouted for the last couple of years. So we know there's a sort of broad consensus that needs for international finance and investment are broadly of the order of magnitude just north of $1 trillion per year in developing countries, and that's built on quite a few different analyses that all come out a little bit different. And the current goal that exists that was met late was the $100 billion climate finance goal that was met in 2023 but set for 2020. Um, what we've seen since we arrived in Baku is a continuation of much of the same challenges in finding a sort of compromise way of accelerating the delivery of finance to developing countries. That is linked to a number of factors. One is that the politics of increasing finance in developed countries at the moment is very challenging. One is that the contributor base that exists under the Paris Agreement is rooted in a list that was made in 1992 under the original Framework Convention. So it excludes quite a lot of quite wealthy countries. And there has been a discussion on whether any of those should sort of join the endeavor. One has been exactly what public finance is needed for. So if we look at how we solve the financing challenge, it involves a mixture of measures. Some of them are structural around how we actually orient the economy. Some of them are around how you mobilize resources domestically. And some of them are around what support you need from the international community in order to implement. And many of these things are enshrined in the Paris Agreement. The major development that we've had so far this week has been that the multilateral development banks, who provide quite a lot of the funding under the 100 billion at the moment, have come forward and said that they would set a target of well, not formally set a target, but they've said that they expect to provide 120 billion dollars in climate finance to lower middle income countries by 2030. And to also mobilize around $65 billion in private finance. And that would provide a basis that is not as ambitious as many were hoping for, but allows to go significantly beyond the 100 billion at the moment if you also include a reasonable increase in the finance that is provided bilaterally by the current providers. There's then a conversation around whether that can go further, and that includes by expanding that base of contributors in the short term. But I think we're looking at a situation in which a goal that is concrete and committed to and deliverable in the short term is likely to be sort of in the very low hundreds of billions of dollars is where things are shaping up. And that opens up the question of how do you bridge that gap? And I think a lot of the discussions over the next week or two will be on both what is the quality of that finance that is provided. So how much of it is going to adaptation in developing countries, and Anna will speak a little bit to that. How much of it is grant based or truly concessional, which means it's lent below market rates, so it's not pure investments. And there'll also be a discussion on what do we do about all of the things that we need to do in order to bridge the divide between that sort of low hundreds of billions number and the plus trillion need. And a lot of that will require things that are quite difficult to do and require multilateral and collective agreement in a lot of different places. And one thing that we have been discussing in a lot of our public commentary is, is there a way of countries agreeing a goal that includes both what they can commit to now in very concrete terms versus what they are willing to strive for if they are able to see collective action in a number of areas. And not all of those need complete global agreement from every single country, but they do need a caucus of the willing and a sort of a critical mass. And there was an interesting event to illustrate this, featuring Mia Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who's been very much behind the Bridgetown Initiative to establish a coalition on solidarity levies, which looked at the application of levies in shipping, aviation, on fossil fuels, some of which will be more difficult than others, but these are the sorts of things that actually to bridge that gap we'll need, but will be very difficult to concretely commit to at this COP for a number of reasons. Beyond that, there's also the need for contributors and providers of finance to actually step up what they're providing. And also to go a bit further, our reading of where the multilateral development banks came out with their number was that it is significant, it's a significant improvement, and they have shown leadership by coming out and putting it out there. But they can go further if they have support from their shareholders and if they have new capital from their shareholders and if they fully implement some of the reform recommendations that exist in the community and have done for a while through forum like the G20. The final thing that I'll just say is that before we go to questions and Anna, I know you want to come in first, is the G20 leaders will be a really critical moment for correcting the course of the political discussion. So Alden talked about it being very normal at this stage in a COP for things to feel a little bit frantic. I mean, we were in Glasgow, and if you asked us a few days in, would we have thought that we were going to turn that around into a reasonable agreement? We would have been very nervous about that. So it is normal for things to feel a bit like this at this stage in the COP. But I do think some of the magnitude of issues that we're looking at in the financing space would benefit from a strong political signal coming from the G20, and that would empower the ministers that will need to pick up the mantle of those negotiations next week, who won't always have all of these levers because they're generally environment ministers, so they need that mandate from leaders. All right, Anna, I will pass over to you and wrap things up there.
Thanks, Rob. Anna, over to you on adaptation.
Thanks, Alden. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so I will be very brief. Adaptation this year has many agenda items that cover a variety of things, including national adaptation plans, the role of the Adaptation Committee, which is the UN body that supports countries in their adaptation efforts, the Global Goal and Adaptation Work Program on indicators, and of course, what Rob mentioned, getting substantial and good quality finance under the NCQG. I think still across all these items, there is one theme that keeps showing up, and that is for the Adaptation Committee to support, for national adaptation plans to be developed and implemented, for the global goal and adaptation to be met, we will need finance. So it is coming down to the NCQG and this new climate finance goal. So it is really the moment for, developed countries and others in a position to do so, to step up and showcase that they care about adaptation and that this is an important step to avoiding further losses and damages. In terms of loss and damage, as Alden said, there was a ceremonial event around the formalization of the process of the Loss and Damage Fund with the signing of the World Bank hosting agreement and the Philippines as the country physically hosting the secretariat. And at that event, Sweden announced a contribution of 200 million Swedish coronas, which is around $18.4 million. It's a good sign that countries are still pledging, but obviously it's not enough. We know that we don't really have a clear idea of how many losses and damages there are, but we know it's in the hundreds of billions. So we welcome this contribution and look forward to more. We also look forward to hopefully the NCQG speaking to this need of loss and damage in some way. We also expect at this COP decisions to be made around the different kind of institutions that deal with loss and damage within the UNFCCC. not only do these institutions need to be financed and enhanced, but there needs to be better coordination among them to make sure that countries are receiving the support that they need. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Anna. And let me just say, conclude with the cover decision. As I said at the beginning, many presidencies have put forward a cover decision or cover text to send strong messages out of their COPs. We saw that in Glasgow with the Glasgow Pact. Obviously, last year it was the global stocktake decision, the so-called UAE consensus that was the cover decision. This year, it's uncertain yet whether the Azerbaijani presidency intends to try to produce a cover decision or not. There are a number of countries that are advocating for that. And not to take away from the centerpiece NCQG finance decision, but to say that more has come out of this COP on other fronts, including adaptation, including mitigation, including the need to scale up ambition. So that is a work in progress. Stay tuned. I think you will start to hear some things about that when ministers arrive and we have the next plenary and stock take session. But that will be a very important thing to send a message to the citizens of the world that in addition to whatever we're able to achieve on the finance front, and as Rob said, that's uncertain at this stage, that countries here, leaders here are committed to raising ambition across all elements of the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. Anna has answered in the chat a question on additional NDCs. As we said, we expected to see an NDC tabled from Azerbaijan. That could still happen. They're the host country. We understand Brazil is going to be putting forward something later this afternoon, actually, and we'll be doing a press conference at 5:30 where you can ask the Brazilian vice president who's here in Baku questions about that. There's rumblings that other countries might do it. There's a possibility that President Biden might put something forward next week at the Rio summit in G20 summit in Rio. But of course, the question is, what will that mean now that he is leaving office on January 20th and will be replaced by Donald Trump, who clearly has no indication, not just of honoring NETC, but staying in the Paris Agreement. So that's remains to be seen. And other countries, as Anna noted, are in the works. Europe's going to take a little bit longer. So let me turn it over to Rob to take, if we can, the other question in the chat about the prospects for the debt issue to be addressed. And then we can I can take the Leaders Summit, the leaders and polluters here. On Alexandra, on your question, there's no formal agreement coming out of the World Climate Action Summit. There's actually breaking news that has just wrapped up with speeches from Morocco, Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Russia, the Republic of Korea, and the USA. So that is over. There will be a high-level segment of the negotiations next week when additional countries that weren't represented here by leaders can make their high-level statements, but there is no negotiation process in the Climate Action Summit. It was basically individual leader statements, country statements to try to add political momentum to the beginning of the process. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Rob, to answer the debt question.
Yeah, thanks, Alden, and thanks for the question. So I think it's exceedingly unlikely that the goal itself would include any sort of concrete measures to tackle debt other than the provision of concessional finance. And that is because that has not been something that has been talked about in the UNFCCC process or ever enjoyed any sort of degree of consensus at the level of decisions. So it's often raised in the negotiating rooms, and it's obviously something that's very important for a lot of countries. But we've never seen that translate into anything that involves concrete measures. What I think you could see and what feels important is an acknowledgement that this goal, which is a mobilization goal, needs to be delivered in a context in which countries are facing a lot of difficulties in mobilizing finance, including because they're in the process of servicing significant debt burdens, and that the way in which the goal is implemented factors into account that wider context and includes potentially measures that can help alleviate it, including things like guarantees. So I don't think the goal will be a conduit for a very concrete commitment on debt, but I think it could see an advancement of the degree to which that interaction is considered. And I certainly think it's a material consideration for the mobilization of finance. So the model that we're putting out for the goal is, there are lots of things that we haven't talked about in the UNFCCC process that the goal can accelerate action on, but that's probably not going to happen in one fell swoop. So how do we create the dialogue within the UNFCCC for when the goal is implemented to consider those issues? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rob. And I'll take a crack at Nick's question from AFP about the presence or absence of the G20 leaders here at the COP. We did have a dearth of leaders from some of the major countries. There's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is that the G20 is holding its own summit in Rio next Monday and Tuesday, and some leaders are also going to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit just before the G20 summit. Of course, I can't speculate why some leaders didn't come here, but I don't think you should take that to mean that they're not committed to action. Action is going to be determined in two forms: what kind of agreement we get on the finance issue here next week, and of course, a leader showing up and giving a statement on Monday or Tuesday the first week is not the indication of seriousness. It's what instructions they give their ministers next week out of capitals to reach an ambitious agreement. The second demonstration of seriousness will be the NDC they put forward under the Paris Agreement. And as I said, we've had a few NDCs from the UAE, UK, and expected this afternoon Brazil. We are not going to get the majority of G20 NDCs on the table probably until early or even well into next year. The G20 collectively accounts for almost 80% of global emissions. So what they do on NDCs is determinative, and we will be keeping pressure high and expectations high for these countries all stepping up. If they don't, there's no way we're going to meet the 1.5 goal, and probably not even the well under 2 degree Celsius goal. If we don't get more ambition on the table until the next round of NDCs in 2030, it's basically game, set, and match. So let me just say that we're going to wrap up now. We had a half an hour for this. If you have additional questions, you can reach out to Ria. If you're not already on our WhatsApp blast system to get our daily updates from across our team, I think we've got almost 20 people here on the ground and more at home watching this. Please do let Ria know you'd like to be added to that list. So thank you all for your time. We'll keep you posted. We will do additional briefings over the course of the 2 weeks. Probably we'll do one towards the end of this week or in the middle weekend. So thank you very much for your time, and have a good rest of your Wednesday. Bye-bye.